In this video, I'm going to walk you through one of my favorite strategies for boosting students' critical thinking skills, and it's using a really simple structure of different types of diagrams called brain frames. Okay, so the learning goal here is I can use simple diagrams to boost my students' critical thinking skills. Okay, so the agenda, first we'll go over what is a brain frame. Next, we'll talk about what is critical thinking, and then we'll practice making some brain frames together. So to start, what is a brain frame? First, I'll start by saying brain frame is kind of a trademarked name. There's an educational company that created these sort of structures of diagrams, but really what they are simple diagrams. You might know them as graphic organizers. They're simple diagrams, they're made by hand, and there's no prep required for them. You don't need to make them ahead of time. And what they do is they focus on a few key areas of critical thinking skills. So there are brain frames for summarizing, comparing and contrasting, analyzing cause and effect, sequencing, so seeing how putting things together in an order, and categorizing. So these are all kind of different areas of critical thinking skills, of analyzing information, of processing it, of drawing inferences from it, making connections. So that's what these diagrams that we'll talk about, that's what these are for. They can be used across subject areas. They are relevant at all grade levels, and they're just a great strategy, whether you're preparing for an essay that you're writing or studying for a test that's coming up, or just trying to help a student dig a little bit deeper into a concept that they're learning about. So I love them for tutoring. I think they're just a really great way for students to practice all of these skills in a lot of different contexts. Okay, so here's just a really quick snapshot of the different types of diagrams. As you can see, these are not, brand new things you've never seen before. They're just kind of a way of taking all these different ideas and just really boiling them down to the essentials. So I'll go through what each of these looks like in a little bit more detail. Before I do, a few best practices for brain frames. So one is to teach the diagram structure first. So if you're using this with a student, and let's say they're writing an essay for a history class, comparing and contrasting Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Before you start making a compare and contrast diagram with them, first teach them just what is the structure. And I recommend using a silly or approachable concept first. So for example, comparing and contrasting limes and frogs. That's something you don't need to have any real academic background to be able to just compare and contrast limes and frogs, but they do have kind of some humorous things in common. So teach the actual structure first using something silly or approachable. Usually these are made by hand, although in a virtual tutoring context, you might be doing them on the Zoom whiteboard. If you are doing it by hand, or really on a whiteboard as well, write the words first before drawing the boxes around them. So as you could see, there's these little bubbles and boxes. A lot of students will draw the box and then fill in the words, and then they end up getting these really tight little squished words, and it doesn't really work, and the whole thing gets very messy and doesn't really serve its purpose. So write the words first and then draw the boxes around them. And then for most students, it works best for them to create the diagram on their own on paper, rather than providing like a pre-made diagram for them to fill in. For some students, they're going to really benefit from having the scaffolding of having a diagram. So if you put those boxes together, like in a Google slide or on the Zoom whiteboard, and then fill in the words with them, that will be really helpful for some students. For many students, most students, just drawing it out by hand themselves is where it will help them really internalize the information. Okay, so we'll quickly go through what each of these different structures look like, and then we'll do some examples together. So the first is summarize. And as you can see, this is really just kind of like different types of analysis where you're just sort of looking big picture here, and you're taking, okay, what's the main idea? So here's how that could look in a few different subject areas. So in ELA, maybe you're looking at the main ideas and key details about characters, themes, settings, or information you've gathered in a nonfiction text. In history or social studies, maybe the main ideas and key details about events, people, policies. In STEM fields, main ideas and key details about really any scientific or mathematical concept. So this is what it looks like. It's a little bit blown up here. The main idea is going to go in the middle, and then they're just jotting down in a box, and then around the edges they're jotting down the related concepts in little bubbles, and they can add little thought bubbles here if they have any ideas, questions, connections, like, oh, this makes me think of that. So I'll show you a really simple one to start. And for each of these, I'll show you, oops, I realized it says cause and effect, but that should say summarizing. I'll fix that. A teachable example. So for this one, it's actually about autumn, right? A teachable example, something easy. I'm recording this in October, so this is, autumn, the changing season is on my mind. So autumn, that's the main idea. Key details, colorful leaves, Halloween, apple cider, pumpkin spice, everything, Thanksgiving, cooler weather, right? So it's just this little mind map. That's another word for these, little mind map of autumn, a little summary. Pretty simple. Okay, comparing and contrasting. So this is a skill that students use across subject areas. And yeah, it takes different levels of complexity depending on what it is you're comparing and contrasting, whether you're comparing and contrasting an apple from an orange, a lime from a frog, or the American Revolution from the French Revolution, right? It's going to look different across the subject area. So here's a few examples. In English language arts, maybe you're comparing characters, perhaps a protagonist and the antagonist. What do they have in common? What's unique about them, right? So Harry Potter versus Voldemort. Maybe you're comparing novels. So maybe maybe your student's been doing a themed study, kind of dystopian novels, and you're going to look at, okay, 1984 versus Brave New World. What looks different in those books? How do the themes differ? How are they the same? For history and social studies, could be doing comparisons of historical figures, wars, social movements. And in STEM, again, there's so many ways that this applies in STEM as well. So metals versus non-metals, mammals versus birds, geometric figures, different types of angles, right? There's always different ways to kind of draw these compare and contrast connections, whether it's to help a student prepare for a test, to write an essay, or just to understand the material a little better. Okay, so this is what this one looks like. And really what this is an expanded Venn diagram. So we've all probably seen a Venn diagram. I've always found that when you're writing a Venn diagram, you can fit a good amount of stuff on the two sides, but that center section, you always end up trying to squish things in, drawing little lines out to, get what you couldn't fit in the middle. So this is just a Venn diagram that's been expanded. So you have your two main concepts that you're comparing in big boxes. And then on the one side, all the things that are unique to concept one. On the other, unique things about concept two. And in the middle, the similarities. So what they have in common. So my favorite example here, and this is something I learned from a past professor of mine, is limes and frogs. So we're going to do that example together. So before I move on here, I'm going to jump out of my slide deck and I'm going to share my screen. So new share. Okay. You're probably going to, here we go. Okay. So I'm going to show you how we do it on paper, and then I'll do another example later on using the Zoom whiteboard. But to start, paper is often the best way to do it. So not all students have document cameras. We know that. You don't need a document camera to do it, but it does come in handy. But if you're working on paper, I figured I'd show you the kind of best practice overall. So we're going to compare and contrast limes and frogs. So I'm going to start, got my paper here. I'm going to start by writing out the word limes. And remember, we're writing the words first and then drawing box around them, and frogs. Okay, so our main ideas are in boxes. Now we're going to think about some similarities and some differences. So the first thing that comes to mind and why I chose this pen color is they're both green. So in the middle, I'm going to write green. I'm going to draw an oval around it, and I'll connect it with some lines. Okay, what's another thing that's similar about them? They're both alive, living organisms. I'll say they're alive, draw that circle, make the connection. And let's say one more connection is that they both live in trees, right? Limes grow in trees. A lot of frogs live in trees. Let's say they live in trees. Admittedly, not all frogs live in trees. Okay, make those connections. So now think about some things that are unique to limes. And these don't have to be one-to-one corresponding things. So you'll kind of see what I mean by that. They can be. So for example, I'll say limes are plants. Whereas frogs are animals. Okay, and I'll just do one more. Might say limes taste sour. Well, that reminds me of another connection. In theory, they're both edible. We might not eat all types of frogs, and not everybody in the world eats frogs, but many people do eat frogs, so they're both edible. So this is a good example. If we say limes taste sour, we don't have to say frogs taste savory. We can say something different about frogs. It's just something that's unique to them. So let's say frogs have eyeballs. Okay. So as you can see, this is one that I like to do with students. It gets kind of silly. They enjoy it. And you can see this connection here. It's a really easy kind of way of mapping it out. So now if you had a student that was writing a paper comparing and contrasting limes and frogs, they've got all their evidence really nicely laid out for them right here. So they can say, you know, limes and frogs have a lot of things in common, and they also have some differences. So some of the things that limes and frogs share in common are that they're both green, they're both alive, they both live in trees, and both edible. Some things that are unique to limes are, et cetera. So it's just a way of essentially getting what's in their brain out onto paper in a way that lets them visualize it. And so I think it's a really great technique that works really well in a lot of different subject areas. So that's going to be our example for limes and frogs. And I'm going to go back to my screen share. And I'll show you another couple examples. Okay. All right, so that's compare and contrast. And next we have cause and effect. So this comes into play with things like climate change, anything in biology, you know, thinking about a lot of connections, a lot of causal processes in biology or chemistry or physics. And then of course, in the context of literature as well. So let's look at some examples. So for English language arts, maybe the main idea in the middle, so I'll show you this quickly. There's a main concept and you're going to look at the causes and the effects. So for ELA, maybe it's a turning point in a character or a plot's development. So for example, what were the causes of that turning point? What were the things that led up to it that caused that turning point? And then what were the effects? How did the character change? How did their relationships change? Also, of course, causal concepts in nonfiction texts. In history, anything related to causes of wars, of social movements, of government policies. And then in STEM, again, any causal process. So climate change is an easy example that comes to mind for me. There's, you know, clear causes, clear effects. Okay, so this is what that looks like again, causes and effects. And the example we'll do here is you didn't do your homework. So let's give this example, and I'm going to do it with the whiteboard here. Okay, so I'll start by drawing my text in the middle, and I'll make it red and bold. So I'll say, you didn't do your homework. So this is an example that you could do with a student. You didn't do your homework. I'm going to draw. You can't, unfortunately, I don't think you'll be able to see the Zoom whiteboard buttons that I'm pressing, but there's options for text boxes and drawing squares and ovals. So you didn't do your homework. That's the main point here. And let's see if I can make it red. Maybe you can't. Oh, well, okay. So now let's think about some causes and effects. Why might a student not have done their homework? So I'm going to adjust the font just to make it a little easier to see or to kind of distinguish. So let's see. One reason a student maybe didn't do their homework is they weren't feeling well. Okay, that's easy. We'll draw a little oval around it. They weren't feeling well. Okay, and then another lovely thing about the Zoom whiteboard is you can really easily add these lines and arrows. So it works really well in a virtual context too. Let's think of one more reason why a student maybe didn't do their homework. Maybe, let's see, maybe they didn't do their homework because they got home from sports practice too late. Okay, let's draw ourselves another oval. Okay, and we'll draw an arrow. Okay, so these are two possible causes of why a student didn't do their homework. So now let's talk about some effects. So one effect that comes to mind is they get a bad grade. Okay, we'll draw our circle. We'll draw our arrow. And one more would be teacher gets mad, right? So these are just like silly, simple examples, but it's a way to understand how, like what this diagram actually means, right? You've got your main idea in the middle, your cause is pointing at it, and then the effect coming out of it. So that's just a good example there of kind of a silly example of cause and effect. And obviously, you could do more than that. You can expand beyond it. You could add, you know, little thought bubbles like, well, maybe homework's not graded. Maybe they can do a makeup, right? There's always ways to add like little extra connections, little notes to yourself for the student to do to kind of make additional connections. Okay, we're going to go back to our presentation. I'll walk through the rest. Oh, and now I've lost it. I think it's up here. Here we go. Okay. All right, categorize. So again, another thing where there's always things that we're categorizing. So across the board here, it's anything that can be sorted into groups based on common traits. In ELA, maybe it's characters, vocabulary words, styles and poems. In history, events, people, policies. In STEM, you know, elements from the periodic table, parts of the body, organs, geographic features, shapes, right? Anything that you can categorize, you can do here. This one is super simple. You've got the main concept at the top, your different categories, and then you just fill in the items. Okay, so a teachable example might be animal families. So, you know, maybe give students a list of 5 different animals from 3 different family groups, mammals, birds, and reptiles, and have them create categories from those. And for this one, I think it's pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to walk you through the hands-on example, but it really is just as simple as writing a little diagram where you've got the main categories on top. So, you know, mammals, birds, reptiles, and then they're filling in, you know, dogs, hawks, lizards, right? Pretty simple. And then sequencing. That's another thing that is just helping students make those connections, helping them understand how one thing flows into another, flows into another. So in ELA, maybe it's outlining the plot sequence or a timeline. Maybe it's outlining the steps of the writing process, you know, pre-writing, first draft, revisions, right? In history and social studies, timelines are the most obvious thing here. So for example, the key events leading up to the Civil War. Also government processes, so like how a bill becomes a law, outlining step by step that sequence there. And then in STEM, scientific processes like cell division, chemical reactions, phases of the moon. There's no reason it has to be a one-way linear thing. This could also just be a circular system, right? So it could be just like any sort of cycle within, you know, the body, the glucose cycle. And then mathematical proofs, which also follow kind of a logical sequence. And again, this one's super simple. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, arrows. If you want to go into another line, just add a little squiggly arrow down to the next line. As I said earlier, none of these are like mind-blowing diagrams that you've never seen before. They're just a set of toolkits to have in mind whenever you have a student that's doing something, we're like, oh, we need to outline these steps in the process. How can we do this in a way that's going to help them really internalize it and give them a clear outline to then use that information, whether it's using that information to write something, using that information to really memorize some facts for a test they have coming up. Okay, so a teachable example here, how to fry an egg, right? Step 1, put a pan on the stove. Step 2, turn on the heat. Step 3, put some oil or butter in the pan, right? Crack an egg. So something like that, which is really basic, really easy for you to go through step by step. Is just a good example for the teachable example to do first before then you go into, okay, so now let's talk about, you know, the steps, the events leading up to the Civil War. Let's put those key events in order and see how they all landed at the Civil War. Okay, so I hope you got something out of this. I hope you'll enjoy using these with your students. As a next step for you, I'd love for you to just like take a moment and think about how can you envision yourself using these with your students? How could you see them applying to the subject area that you tutor or teach? Yeah, and if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out. In this presentation here, you'll have access to all those main diagrams, and you can also show that to the student ahead of time. So if you're like, okay, we're going to do this compare and contrast exercise. Here's what the diagram is going to look like. You show them the, you know, the boxes and the bubbles, and then get into making an example, whether it's using the Zoom whiteboard, using pen and paper with a doc cam or without a doc cam. Either way, I hope it's helpful.